Let's talk about feeling anxious about anxiety. In this video, we're going to talk about how anxiety is different than stress, the neuroscience of anxiety, what it really means, and how understanding the neuroscience of anxiety can give you some tools. And we're going to offer a bunch of highly effective strategies that you probably haven't seen somewhere else to help you manage anxiety and use anxiety as something positive instead of something negative. One of the most frequent online searches in this topic is my anxiety normal? Or might there be something wrong? Anxiety is confusing because it's a word we use for a feeling, and it's also a word we use for a brain illness. When people are struggling with an anxiety disorder, their chemistry is out of balance, and the strategies that can help all of us with anxiety are not going to be enough. Some people talk about it like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. If you're struggling with anxiety and it's negatively affecting your daily life for multiple days in a row, please get help. I heard a child psychiatrist describe it this way. If you have this many reasons to be anxious, but your anxiety is this big, it may mean you have an anxiety disorder. And if it's persisting over time and it's causing you to lose quality of life, then it's worth checking out and talking to a mental health professional to find out if you have an anxiety disorder, because you can get help with that. And even if you have an anxiety disorder, the strategies that I'm going to share in this video can help you, but they're really designed for all of us with normal anxiety. It's a feeling that means that there's a generalized threat. Where fear is connected with a very specific danger and stress is connected with a specific problem, anxiety is generalized, and it's a sense that there's something out there. One thing that's useful to understand about anxiety is that humans are social animals, and we're really at the top of our food chain in most places. And so the stressors in our lives are not really, are we going to get eaten? As social animals, danger is most frequently connected with being outside of the group. And so many sources of anxiety are connected with social uncertainty, not knowing where we stand, not feeling psychologically safe, not knowing if we have allies, not knowing whether people are going to like us or not. And that might sound trivial, but at a neurobiological level, we are adapted for survival. This is deep in our architecture. And if we aren't connected with the group, it's dangerous for us. And so things like, do I get enough likes on social media, is triggering this foundational visceral reaction. Social media algorithms know this, and developers have actually created their systems to trigger this anxiety so that we get more dependent on using these tools. But of course, that fuels social anxiety. It's one of the reasons that loneliness is such an important indicator of mental health challenges in the world, and loneliness is at an all-time high. People don't feel connected, and when they don't feel connected, these social triggers of anxiety have more intensity and are harder to deal with. Cigna, one of the world's largest insurers, did a massive study in 2018 and found that among adults, loneliness is so high that it's reaching epidemic levels. 61% of adults report being lonely. That's almost a 20% increase in 1 year. And we know that with the pandemic and other factors such as climate change, people are feeling even more disconnected now. What this means is 3 in 5 people in the US are feeling loneliness. And it's even worse in many other places in the world. All of this is to say that we're in a condition that causes the social anxiety reactions to become more volatile, more intense. Let's talk a little bit more about the differences between stress and anxiety. Mental health first aid offers a useful distinction that stress is triggered by something outside us, and anxiety is something that's going on inside us. Sometimes people describe stress as a physiological or physical condition, and anxiety as an emotional condition. Stress tends to be more specific, anxiety tends to be more general. And very importantly, when the causes of the problem are reduced, stress reduces, but often anxiety persists. Anxiety is frequently a byproduct of stress, or chronic stress seems to trigger and reinforce anxiety. What we're looking at is this feeling of anxiousness, which is a message that there's some kind of problem out there. And because anxiety is generalized, we don't necessarily know what the problem is. And the helpful function of anxiety is to make us more vigilant, to help us look around, to tell us we need to find out what the problem is, and we might need to make some change. And this is the real benefit of anxiety. It's why we have it. Anxiety can help us to mobilize us into action. Action against climate change, action to have more social connectedness, action to do things different in our lives. So there's benefits of anxiety, but only if we can really understand it and work with it. So let's talk about how it actually works in the brain. In some of our other videos, we've talked about the amygdala and the trigger of the threat response. The anxiety response is fairly similar. Anxiety is connected with the same kind of neurohormones that we experience in stress, and it's one of the reasons that stress and anxiety are often confused. Cortisol and epinephrine, or adrenaline, are two of the key neurohormones involved. When we begin to feel anxious, what's happening is our amygdala is being triggered to identify a potential threat. Our hypothalamus starts producing these neurohormones. And then under the direction of the thalamus, which is like a master regulatory valve, we begin to arouse the amygdala response and release these chemicals that are affecting our brain and our bodies. There's a kind of first reaction, which is this chemical response system we've talked about in our videos about why emotions last for about 6 seconds. And then, because often the threats that cause stress and anxiety are longer lasting, we have a secondary system using the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, ANS, is what regulates all kinds of unconscious responses in our body. Herbert Benson, who started the Mind-Body Institute at Harvard Medical School back in the 1970s, was one of the first physicians in the US to start talking about this system and understanding that there's an emotional connection with our biological health and our heart health. Dr. Benson describes the ANS having two components, a kind of accelerator in the car, the gas pedal, and the brakes. The sympathetic nervous system is the gas pedal. When the sympathetic nervous system is triggered, it turns on the gas, otherwise known as the HPA axis. The hypothalamus starts producing neurohormones that trigger the pituitary glands and the adrenal system, and we start to produce additional adrenaline, technically called epinephrine, and cortisol. And these two chemicals, as I mentioned, are connected with the threat response to stress and also to this emotional reaction called anxiety. Cortisol has a number of beneficial functions. It is a form of energy production, and it helps get our muscles ready for faster reactivity. It helps close down the capillaries in the surface of our skin so that more blood stays in our trunk. And cortisol helps us pay attention to threats by blocking serotonin uptake. Serotonin helps us feel calm, and cortisol blocks that so that we remain vigilant. And that's a good thing when there's danger. And when we're not really sure what that danger is, in the case of anxiety, it's important for us to be vigilant and look around and assess and be in this state of readiness for some problem that might come. One of the interesting things about cortisol is that it's also connected to learning and memory. It actually takes some stress in order to activate our learning brain. And one of the really fun tools that we have in the EQ store is called a biodot. And when the biodot is green, it indicates you have some stress, but green is correlated with the readiness for learning. Cortisol helps us say, hey, something's happening here, I need to pay attention. But it blocks some of our more nuanced memory and ability to recall details, such as trying to remember somebody's name at a party. What's happening is that our brains are shifting into this fight, flight, or freeze mode, causing us to pay attention to big things and lose track of little things. We've shared in other videos about some of the physiological effects of stress, so I'm not going to get into that now. But cortisol has some downsides that we really need to pay attention to. And it's one of the reasons why anxiety is often connected with issues with your circulatory system as well as your digestive system. Okay, so remember the autonomic nervous system has two parts. We've talked about the gas, but let's talk about the brakes, the parasympathetic nervous system. One of the important discoveries at the Harvard Medical School Mind-Body Institute is that Herbert Benson found that we could trigger this relaxation response. We could trigger the parasympathetic nervous system by changing our breathing, by changing what we're paying attention to, by social reappraisal and feeling more connected. But I'm going to get into that in a minute when we go into strategies for managing anxiety more effectively. So let's talk about strategies for managing anxiety. First of all, remembering that anxiety is connected with the social brain functions, it makes sense that many strategies for mitigating anxiety are going to be connected with social activation, increasing your social supports, reaching out to people, feeling gratitude for the people you're connected with, recognizing that you're not alone. And if you are alone, doing the challenging work of building relationship is going to be an important part of reducing anxiety and making it work for you better. I have 5 emotional intelligence strategies for helping you with feeling anxious about anxiety. The first is to validate your feeling, to recognize that this feeling is there and that maybe even it's there to help you. A lot of times when we have difficult feelings, we push them aside. And there's some interesting research that was done with women who were pregnant and worried about Zika virus, where they tried a whole bunch of different strategies. And none of them worked very well. But interestingly, when they tried to suppress their feeling, it made the fear more intense. So there's something about denying this experience of anxiety that causes it to rear its head and say, hey, you really need to pay attention to me. Dan Siegel says, name it to tame it. If we can understand our feelings and acknowledge them and maybe even make friends with them, we can start to have a better relationship with all of our feelings, including anxiety. If you think about validating your parking ticket, somebody goes and puts a stamp on it. They're actually putting value on your ticket. So when you're validating your feeling, it's not just acknowledging it, but actually considering that it might be there to help you. Anxiety tells us that there's some kind of problem and we need to figure out what it is. And this really brings us to the second strategy, which is about narrowing focus. One of the challenges with anxiety is that it's generally not connected with a specific problem. And so we start to have this sense that there's a threat all around us and that we become increasingly worried about everything. And often when people are feeling a lot of anxiety, what they'll do is they'll try to control something, which isn't the thing they're really anxious about, but to have this sense of control. And that can go awry because you end up getting into a power struggle or you end up working on something that's not really what the problem is. So one of the first questions that I suggest you ask yourself is this even my problem? Is this something that I'm responsible for? Is this something that matters to me? Or am I, carrying a lot of shoulds or guesses or expectations? Am I making assumptions about what I'm supposed to be doing or supposed to be feeling? If this really is my problem, then I can tune in and say, is it within my sphere of control or my sphere of concern? Most of us have a much larger sphere of concern than sphere of control. And saying, if it is my problem, is it something that I'm concerned about but can't really do anything about? Or is there something I can actually do something about? And focusing on the things that we want to take responsibility for that are in our sphere of control or in our sphere of influence, we're able to do something about it. So, narrowing the focus down to say what part of this is mine and what part of this can I actually take action on. That develops a greater sense of agency, which is an important part of handling anxiety in a positive way. In other videos, you've heard me talk about exercising optimism. And exercising optimism is a very powerful tool that can help you with this. The idea of agency I just talked about is connected with exercising optimism, but so is suspending judgment. Oftentimes when people are feeling anxious, what they'll do is they'll awfulize. And they'll do that as a way to protect themselves. And they'll say, this is going to be so bad, and all these negative things are going to happen. And it's a way of, again, having a kind of illusion of control by saying, well, if I think how bad it is, I won't be surprised when something negative happens. Of course, what that ends up doing is making you miserable about everything in your life. And that fuels pessimism, and that increases stress, which increases the anxiety. So rather than just saying, okay, it's going to be fine, which you kind of know it's not, you also don't really know how bad it's going to be. So what I would encourage you to do is just suspend judgment, to stay in a state of data gathering, to say, I don't really know if this is going to be good or if this is going to be bad. And because I don't know, I'm not going to jump to a conclusion. I'm going to be curious. If you can replace anxiety with curiosity, it will help take that vigilance that you're feeling and that need to look around and find what the problem is and really understand it in a deeper way. In one of our articles about anxiety, we'll put it in the show notes, there's a strategy about shifting from anxiety to say, what's important here? Because when we feel anxious, it means that there's something going on. We're perceiving some kind of a problem, but we don't exactly know what it is. And generally speaking, when we feel a lot of anxiety, it's because we're perceiving a very big problem or something's not quite right because something is important. And so tuning in to what's important is a strategy for you to stay out of that conclusion state and in that curiosity state. Because we're trying to see all of our feelings as allies, and we're trying to make friends with our emotions and not be in reaction to our feelings, instead of trying to suppress the feeling or push it away, one of the things you can do is shrink it. And visualizing the feeling getting lighter. So as you imagine, if you kind of sit back and maybe close your eyes and you imagine this feeling, many people who are feeling anxious will imagine it as this like dark cloud with lightning and it's very intense. And instead of saying, I want that to go away, try just imagining it getting a little bit lighter, a little bit smaller, a little bit further away from you. You're not trying to get rid of it. You're trying to step back from it and take some perspective. You can couple this with breathing, going for a walk, drinking water, and you have a number of strategies that help you produce more serotonin, including laughing, smelling flowers, and just appreciating what's good in the world, even if it's just a tiny thing. The goal isn't to get rid of the anxiety. The goal is to move away from it a little bit so that you can understand it better. Think about it like this. You could have a song that's playing and you turn up the volume so high you can't even figure out what the words are. And maybe it's a song you even like, but unless you get a little bit of distance from it, it's hard to make sense of it. So if you think about that anxiety in that same way, that it's maybe not a negative thing, but maybe it's just too much, and can you turn the volume down a little bit, or can you lighten the color of it, or you can step back a little bit from it so that you can hear the message and not just the noise. The last one is to clean up your clutter. And there's some interesting research that found that when somebody is in a cluttered environment, their bottom-up neural processing, which is basically our automatic processing that's happening without conscious control, becomes distracted by the clutter. And this was particularly true for women, by the way. In this more cluttered environment, our brains are having trouble sorting out what's important, and that increases our sense of anxiety. And in this particular study, it also increased people's tendency to eat unhealthy foods. We can take this idea of decreasing the clutter, both to the physical clutter, but also to the mental and emotional clutter in our lives. Most of us have a lot of things that are not resolved in our lives. Most of us have a lot of things that we're thinking about. Sometimes just making a list, organizing our ideas, deciding there's some things to let go of, there's some relationships that we need to repair, or cleaning up our physical environment, or simplifying our days. There are many kinds of clutter in our lives. And again, this clutter becomes like noise, which makes it harder for us to figure out what is really important in this situation and what we should be paying attention to. So in addition to the improving social conditions, the 5 strategies are to validate your feeling, to narrow the focus, to suspend conclusion, to shrink it instead of suppress it, and to clean up the clutter. When people are struggling with anxiety, it can be incredibly painful. Each quarter we publish an EQ Cafe, and we have people around the world who volunteer and hold these events in hundreds of cities. And a couple of years ago we did an EQ Cafe on anxiety, and we asked people to give us metaphors for what it's like to feel anxious. And for some people it is crippling. For some people it's paralyzing. For some people it's difficult to get up in the morning because their anxiety is so overwhelming. I want to remind you that you can get help and you deserve help, and that all of us can benefit from making friends with our anxiety and trying out strategies to use it in a way that's positive. Hi, I'm Josh Freedman. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please share it, like it, subscribe, comment. That really helps us with our work to bring emotional intelligence to everyone in the world. These are skills that are really needed in the world right now, and we need you to help us help others.